Bonjour, hello, guten Tag, and ciao. My name is Paul Prad. I'm professor of music by Laprade, professor of music at the University of St. Francis in Joliet, Illinois, the United States. I am honored and excited to be here with you virtually today at the 18th annual conference of the New Directions in Humanities organization. It is a pleasure to present my paper, Appropriation and Conversation in the Art of Music. I'll deal with the synergy and struggle through the appropriation and claiming of artifacts in music. For today, I'll be sharing a PowerPoint with you. I hope that you'll be able to stop this video and at some point use those links found in the video to listen to the examples I have. Let's begin. For today, what I'd like to do is discuss a number of things. First, we need working definitions in order for us to continue. A few working definitions are in store. The first is appropriation itself. I find the definition of the Oxford English Dictionary as useful as any. Appropriation is the making of a thing private property, taking it as one's own to one's own use. Art can be defined a number of different ways. It's complex since every culture has its own definition of what art may or may not be. Central to us is the idea, however, that a class of artifacts which are valuable objects with aesthetic properties. The culture may or may not view this artwork or as artwork or even an artistic element. Music composition is the conscious placement of sound in time, sometimes unconscious, but normally in Western art music, we're speaking about conscious placement. Culture, an aggregate of generally shared customs, laws, art, morals, values, and other traits which bind a society or a group of people together. And finally, music performance. This is the articulation of a musical composition. What is a music composition? And that's rather important for us to discuss. What are the elements, the basic elements of music composition? For my thesis today, what I'd like to do is examine what creates a music composition, those elements that do, those other elements that are created from the basic elements of music, and use that as a reference point for us to understand appropriation in a different way. The basic elements of an unfixed media performance of music composition are the following things. Pitch. Pitch is the height of vibration, therefore the height of what we hear or the depth of what we hear in terms of a sound. Da, da, two different pitches, one high, one low. The absence of pitch can also be considered pitch. That is, in the same way that black can be viewed as the absence of white and so forth in color palette theory. Moving on, duration. Duration is the length of a sound. Da, da. Timbre is the quality of that sound, the quality of a sound. 3 timbres done with my voice. Da, do, da. Dynamics. Dynamics is a reference for what we call volume in normal parlance. Dynamics can be loud, soft, all the grades between, too loud, too soft, so forth. Also, gradations between each of these volume levels is appropriate. Finally, form. Form is a combination of many of these, and yet form defines so many things that we understand to be music composition, whether that's stochastic or in any other way defined. Here's an example of form applied to the number of items. I'll keep pitch, or the pitch vocabulary, simple, 2 pitches. Durations of these will be approximately the same. Timbre will be approximately the same, and so will dynamics. I'll use 4 sounds, 2 pitches. Do, mi, do. Reversing that. Mi, do, mi. These are 2 separate compositions in some ways, even though one can assert a relationship between them. And of course, one can change them as well. But nonetheless, we can consider this to be a music composition, however simple. So the 5 elements exist in all music. Moving on, another look at music composition. Even though I've given you examples of these 5 basic elements, we also need to recognize that in performance, these are sometimes realized in a slightly different way. For example, my do, mi, do, we sing do, mi, do. In that case, dynamics change slightly. Perhaps another person will sing the same piece, timbre will change. On a different day, I may think I'm singing in the same duration, but perhaps by a few milliseconds, each of these sounds may be shorter or longer. And similarly, on another day, without a reference, maybe my pitch will have changed. So there is if you will, a little bit of laxity in terms of how one may express musical composition. As we take a look at these, it's important to realize that, therefore, the expression of a musical composition can be quite different from one instance to another. So issues of flexibility are important for us to consider. For example, if one listened to these links, and of course we don't have time today, but if one were listened to the rondeau from the lovely piece by J.F. Handel, we listened to one performance by Tafelmusik done on presumably period instruments. And those instruments are interesting because the pitch that's performed on them is slightly lower than the next one. The next example I give is B, which is done on modern instruments. The time when Handel would have written would probably have included an agreement that the pitch chosen was the exact pitch that is played on the first set of instruments and not on the second. So pitch to some extent, intonation to some extent, is variable in terms of our understanding of what a music composition will be. Handel may have noticed the pitch change, maybe not. If he had lived today, that is. Timbre and duration. Here I had an example of a period instrument group playing this particular piece, very different than the Tafelmusik first example, yet the sound was a little bit more nasal, da, da, with that type of sound to it, if you will, and versus a piano rendition. Piano obviously was not the first instrument why this was written. It was written for an ensemble, yet it can be transcribed to piano, and it's very likely that Handel played this on some type of keyboard. So an example of the type of keyboard that he may have used would have been the harpsichord. For that period, the harpsichord was the go-to instrument, as was the organ. He was an organist, but it would have played the harpsichord. The performance I have is a bit different. The pitch is a little bit different than in all the other examples. The timbre of a harpsichord is different than piano or period instruments or even contemporary instruments. Duration in this particular case would be different simply because the tempo chosen by the performer is slower, much slower. Dynamics are also a little bit different on the harpsichord in that they're more graded. That is, we have one volume or another, two volumes in the particular performance that I had chosen. And that would have been quite typical of some performances. Yet the interesting thing is that pitch is not only different in this performance in terms of height of pitch, but also in terms of the actual pitches expressed. That is, the performer decided to use period ornamentation. So instead of ta-da, it was dum-ba-dum, that type of thing. Filling in sounds, filling in spaces, adding to it, ornamenting it in much the same way as one would ornament one's clothing or a tree or some other item. In any case, the number of pitches is multiplied, perhaps by as much as 50% in the chosen performance. And therefore, all of these are considered reasonable performances of Handel's rondeau. However, the rondeau is performed in many different ways. So how do we really take a look at this performance being so flexible? What is really happening? Well, let's take a look at the abstract singularities included in what I would call a music composition. First, we have the basic elements of music composition seen here on the bottom. We've discussed these. Moving on, we might discuss their instrumentation, their orchestration, the medium in which they're presented, the articulation used in order to perform the piece. It may be different. Secondary aggregates that may be considered is the melodic contour, and at this point we're getting a little bit closer to what the piece would be. What would be characteristic of the piece? It's melodic contour, the style, form, phrasing, the mode and key chosen, and so forth. Here we begin to pull away elements of what I would call basic style, which are found, of course, in the choice of instrumentation, pitches, and so forth. We move beyond general vocabulary to something a little bit more precise. Phrasing, for example, a Brahmsian phrase is very different than that of Beyonce, is very different than that of the Beatles, is very different than that of Handel or Purcell, for that matter. as is the harmonic family chosen. So as we go from bottom to top, if you will, we begin to get a little bit more precise about which composition we're performing, the period, the style, the composer, and so forth. As we move to the top, the tertiary aggregate of traits, we deal with melody. Here we find a specific melody, perhaps associated solely with this piece, likely, motifs used, counterpoint that may be written to accompany that melody, harmonic choices, which would be intrinsic to the vocabulary of the composer or to the period or even to the piece, and articulation. So even though some of these categories aren't as separate as one would imagine, they could actually blend together to some extent. There is a hierarchy, and as one moves from bottom to top in this particular chart, one moves from a general description of pieces like this one to this particular piece. The more defining we are in our approach to discussing melody, motifs, and counterpoint, the more closely we are defining this singularity, this particular piece. This is important for us as we continue. These groups of performances I've just mentioned, even though they vary greatly, all become part of one category, one group of pieces, and I like to call this the composition class. What is a composition class? It's the set of all articulations of the composition which possess the essential qualities of the perceived original. Now, there are definitions here that I think we need to be very careful about. For example, who defines this? What is essential? Is it possessed by, are these pieces found with these particular items? For example, in the case of pitch, these different pitch levels of the previous recordings could make one ask whether or not they are actually the same piece. In my case, synesthesia is very strong. I associate the key of E flat with a very particular feeling, and I note that that particular feeling is associated perhaps with many pieces in Brahms that have the same aesthetic or similar aesthetics. So if I hear a piece in D major performed in E flat major simply because of choice of instrument or a choice of different orchestration, will I feel differently? Is it the same piece for me? There are many questions. As you can see, pitch, duration, timbre, dynamics, all of these can be varied to some extent. Who decides this? What prevents a piece from being part of this composition class when it contains so many other elements? Also, what are the limits to this? Are these related to experience? Are these related to training, perception? Whoever decides what belongs in this composition class becomes part of a committee, if you will. And it seems to me that in my experience that most professionals will agree that something lies within this particular class. Of course, there are exceptions, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. So what I would do is then present these links for you. And the first three are all performances of When I'm Laid in Earth by Purcell. When I am laid, perhaps very popular to all of you from his opera Dido and Aeneas. This piece has taken on life of its own. It's been revered by many people, both in the so-called art music field and also in the popular music field. First example I would give you is that of Jeff Buckley, a popular performer who died several years ago, yet was quite interested in this literature and performed it, yes, with a little bit of a rock and roll edge. Is it the same piece? Some people would actually say that it is the piece, but not in the way it was intended to be performed. Therefore, it would not be part of this composition class if we were trying to realize whatever the expectation and realization could have been in the mind of the composer. In the second example, in the second YouTube example, I would have given you a performance of a female. In this particular case, one could ask the same question. Would Purcell have envisioned a female on stage? The answer to that is probably no, yet the performance is quite convincing, in my opinion. The third example is that of a countertenor, which would be much closer to what we would expect in an original Purcell performance. And one wonders whether or not the timbre of that particular voice is part of this composition class, part of the visualization of this piece as it was written. How intrinsic is it? How important is this? Good questions to bring up. Finally, the other example I've given here is the Handel or not example. It's the famous Hallelujah chorus from Messiah. Hallelujah. However, this particular version is in a gospel style. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Given that type of interpretation, one which could not have existed in the 1700s, have we really articulated another version of the Messiah? Is it still the Messiah? Or is the arrangement far enough from the original Alleluia for it not to be an example of Handel? Good questions to bring up. Therefore, one of the things I'd like to discuss is the possibility of there being a tolerance interval, that being a certain area where we find that a composition class is likely to be defined, and in an area, and defining the areas in which the tolerance would not be possibly maintained for considering something as part of this class. So if you take a look at this example, what is a tolerance interval? This example or this diagram will show you what I mean. And I use the term T levels, by the way, for there to be certain levels of tolerance. So what is it? A measurement of the distance between the set of essential qualities in an articulation of a composition, that is performance, and the essential qualities understood to be possessed by the perceived original composition. And I refer to these with T levels. One does historical research, one clearly reads sources, one obtains instruments, one does research simply to try and ask the question, what could this have sounded like? Now, of course, since the 20th century, we've had sound sources that are static, and we can get an idea of that, what that might have been. However, in this particular case, we ask ourselves, how can we recreate that? And of course, static recordings are not necessarily exactly a composer's conception for a piece. One can ask how the interpretation went. Has the interpretation been faithful? Many questions arise. Nonetheless, let's take a look at the diagram. If you take a look at this, you'll see that there are three areas. One of the center of it, if you will, the iris, is the conceptually pure articulation. I like to think of this in some ways as a theoretical articulation, one that one hears in one's mind, what this should sound like, what this could sound like, and how it was written is only an expression. It means to try and communicate that to what will essentially be a performer. So then we move from that to what would be an acceptable performance. Acceptable performance, obviously, by people who decide what is acceptable. Those professionals will decide if this is faithful to style, faithful to the meaning of the original work, faithful to what the work was trying to express, faithful to the sonic environment that is being described by notation or by some other form. And that primary articulation, therefore, would be considered part of the composition class. Then we move away from that to other articulations which may not be so clear. An example would be Bob Dylan being sung by some in bel canto voice. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Is an articulation of Bob Dylan's spirit? Is it articulation of what he envisioned for his piece? One never knows. One needs to ask Bob Dylan, I would imagine, and yet one needs to also have an idea of what is acceptable and why those ideas are acceptable. In any case, there are other articulations of this. If one would sing this piece, blowing in the wind, with wrong words, with wrong pitches, with rhythms that render it nearly unrecognizable, then these other articulations are performances but do not fall within the composition class, and therefore the tolerance interval would be one almost of an intolerance, if you will. In any case, that particular articulation would not allow the piece to be considered part of the family, if you will. So then we take a look at a few case studies, and these are rather important. In the first case study, I have an original Bach, the toccata in fugue in D minor, and I have an arrangement of it by Stokowski, a very famous conductor who led the Philadelphia Orchestra and rewrote the piece in many ways by adding percussion and by also orchestrating a full orchestra. And it's a compelling performance, and one can ask ourselves, is this Bach? Bach did not have most of these instruments available to his hands. What would Bach have appreciated this? Continuing on, a revision. One example where Bach actually revised a piece was taking Handel's work, the Violin Concerto RV 230, and taking that particular work and transcribing it, if you will, for trumpet, and adding a number of things. First of all, some of the lines, some of the melodic lines are changed. The counterpoint is strengthened, one would say, if one views it from Bach's point of view. And yet, would Vivaldi have wanted this to be rendered in this more enhanced fashion? It reminds me in some ways of the reorchestration and enhancements of the Messiah done subsequently by Haydn and Mozart. Good question. Is it too thick? Does it sound right? Is this what he would have imagined? Moving on. Case study, re-envisioning. Here, the piece I played earlier, would have played earlier, etc., is rendered into a new work in many ways by Benjamin Britten, who took this theme, this Handelian theme, and reorchestrated just the theme, not the remainder of the piece, and created a piece called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. This composition explores all the families of instruments in the orchestra and does so in a very convincing way that creates a new work based on this theme. Of course, the theme is cited, the attribution is made at the very beginning in the introduction, but yet the experience of the piece is entirely different. One has instruments that never would have been conceived of in Handel's time, and furthermore, the expression of that particular theme is dramatic and creates a very, very different sonic soundscape. Finally, the Beatles. One can often point to the Beatles for a number of things. One of them being that they had an uncanny ability to bring many different sources together and create something new, which weren't necessarily, if you will, attributions that were derivative, but rather a synergy is created to create a new product that is a combination of many influences. The first one I would have played is I'm Down, which is a very interesting piece. It contains a little bit of the harmonic playfulness of the Beach Boys and the harmonic soundscape of that. Chuck Berry chords on the bottom, the harmony is played and improvised in many ways in a Chuck Berry perspective, boogie woogie, if you will. And the vocal part, the main vocal part, oddly enough, is imitating Little Richard, a wonderful singer, wonderful soul R&B singer from late 1950s, early 60s. Lennon and McCartney were very clear about where these influences had come and said, well, we've got this and this and this, and we put it all together. This product is new, yet its derivation, if you will, is quite clear. They were quite open about it, and the result is different than if we had relied upon any of these individuals before the Beatles to create this product. Similarly, Lennon and McCartney create songs. One of them is called Norwegian Wood, a tribute to John Lennon. Norwegian Wood uses a sitar. However, the sitar is not used in the way that would normally be used in Indian music, but it uses sitar to play a melody. So itself, the piece in itself borrows from Bob Dylan's folk style, borrows again from the sonic or timbral vocabulary of Indian music, and creates a new whole. Interestingly enough, that piece is reinterpreted and beloved in many different styles, and we could discuss whether or not that piece's performance in terms of the Buddy Rich Orchestra is still remaining within this composition class, simply because the Buddy Rich Orchestra decides to take it as a jazz waltz, that type of thing, including improvisations and orchestration for big band, if you will, that transforms it in a very interesting way. Lost is the sitar, obviously. The melody still survives, and the harmony is enhanced in a very different way that is very typical of jazz. In some ways, the idea that this is jazzed up allows a little bit of flexibility in terms of the appropriation. And so here we have a great deal of flexibility about what might be considered part of a composition class, and that flexibility does include appropriation, many different types of appropriation, if you notice. Let's move on. So let's take a look at appropriation in a different way. Let's take a look at how this might happen in terms of a performance, which is what we have been discussing. If you will, the large circle on the left deals with composition number 1. So we spoke about the conceptually pure articulation of that composition, that version that's in the composer's mind. The primary articulation was the acceptable, if you will, professional acceptable version of it. Secondary articulations, which may be acceptable, may be a little bit questionable sometimes. And of course, that relies itself in a larger, all of this in a larger context and syntactic gesture vocabulary that drives the piece, that gives the piece a place in history and time and also within a particular composer's oeuvre. If we move to the right-hand side, you'll see that sometimes this also can be applied to a genre. There'll be a certain type of performance that is typical and accepted by a particular genre. What does Baroque music sound like? What does rock and roll sound like? What does disco sound like? What does EDM sound like? That particular pure articulation of that in the composer's mind does exist generically. And of course, there are performances that would be considered acceptable and professional within each of these genres. And to move on as well, secondary articulations which are less successful. One is reminded of the way that Frank Sinatra sometimes tried to sing the Beatles, and sometimes did so successfully and other times not. Sometimes with an attempt to emulate that sound unsuccessfully. The reason I'm putting these two circles together is to really point out the fact that appropriation can be a blending sometimes. As in the big band version, we could say that the genre on the right-hand side, as you see, the genre is jazz, and the associations having to do with jazz. What does jazz sound like? What are the affects of jazz? What is an articulation of well-played jazz and so forth? Can impinge itself in performance onto the piece, which is on the left-hand side. Imagine, for example, that someone who is well-versed in jazz and not so well-versed in classical music, but can play all the notes, would play Beethoven. There would be overtones in her performance that might hint at their comfort in the jazz style rather than their comfort in other styles such as classical music. One's performance ability, one's performance vocabulary sometimes impinges itself upon one's performance. I might even say always does. And so this brings us to the idea of there being stylistic issues. And stylistic issues need not only be that of genre, but also that of particular articulation. And so when we talk about different levels of articulation, as we did earlier, we may find that the jazz example that I just gave you might be quite good. There might be swung eighth notes, T, da, 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 that find its way into the performance of the first piece, of the initial piece that we would choose. And that may or may not be welcome to that. In fact, it may impinge upon what would be, if you will, an acceptable performance. Similarly, sometimes a type of primary articulation from this style, the second style, composition number 2 or genre number 2, might find its way into the performance of number 1. And when this happens, we not only have appropriation of style and gesture from another area, but transference, if you will. An example of this is a Michael Bolton performance of opera. That type of vocal sound rather than a pure bel canto sound, or we'll say Verdi, would not necessarily be welcomed, and in fact would speak probably more loudly in a very distracting way of the origin of the voice and style. So in this case, we get perilously close to define what would be considered a professional or an accepted performance of a particular piece, depending if there is an appropriation of a style or other elements found in a different genre. Therefore, what I'm trying to point out is very simple on this case, that appropriation is always part of music. Appropriation is found in music. Appropriation is, at certain points in music history, appropriation was actually celebrated. I'm quite sure that Bach, in rewriting Vivaldi, was not thinking that appropriation was incorrect. In fact, many of the pieces he had already worked with were actually expansions of Lutheran hymns and other materials found in the works of others. So at this point, when we look for purity of a composition, we need to consider a number of different things. And one of these is that appropriation is found and is almost inevitable as one's training and one's history influences these ideas. Nonetheless, we can go a little bit further and discuss appropriation in a different fashion, because at this point, we've been discussing appropriation in terms of performance. I'd like to introduce the idea of tolerance level in a different way at this point. So appropriation, what can happen? One can, for example, be taking a look at the aggregates we had spoken about in a very different way. For example, in an appropriation level, which I would call the very basic one, where basic elements are copied, traded, and so forth, one could take many, many elements and still not identify a piece and still not really, if you will, steal from another genre or another composition. An example of this would be pentatonic melodies. Pentatonic melodies are found in many cultures, and certainly many times when one takes a look at a certain culture that finds quite a few compositions and quite a few articulations of the pentatonic scale in their melodies, one could find a number of instances where pentatonic music can be found. In fact, one can point to the use of pentatonic music in American spirituals, and at the very same time in many pieces of American pop music in the late 1960s and 70s, particularly soul music. One wonders, and one could suggest there is a connection between these. However, that's not the point. The point is that there's a common language that can be found. And so this would be the lowest tolerance level, if you will, tolerance level that would not be considered necessarily appropriation, but rather influence. And so influence in the sense of a shared vocabulary does not necessarily define appropriation, except in the most general way, in almost a way that isn't to be considered strongly. But as we move up from the basic elements area, we can take a look at other items that are not only influence, but in some ways appropriation. The examples of these lie very well in art music and the use of instrumentation, choice of instrumentation or orchestration, the medium used, and also the articulation of particular types of pieces. Early examples of this would be found in, good examples of this would be found in early Stravinsky, whose palette for the Firebird was very, very similar to that of several Rimsky-Korsakov works. The symphonies of the teacher find their way into the style, if you will, of the student. Although Stravinsky doesn't sound fully like Rimsky-Korsakov, certainly the palette that he was using, if you want to use that analogy, the palette he was using had many of the same colors. And indeed, even though there are unique moments, the influence is felt. Going back to the Beatles example, if you will, then one can point out that the timbre used by early Beatles was imitated in many ways by a group called Badfinger and several other groups in the British invasion, that being that one would have a guitar, maybe two guitars, and piano, if not two guitars, bass and drums. And that model for quite a while was imitated simply because of the success of the Beatles. Again, emulation often finds much more than pitch, rhythm, and so forth. It works its way up into the aggregates that I'm pointing out as being essential to a composition. So one way that one can cite influence is certainly to go to that next level. Have they appropriated timbre? Perhaps. And one moves up, of course, as time goes on. This level of imitation, if you will, and appropriation of sound and several other things I considered to be a tolerance level 1. One can sense, if you will, one can sense the influence. One can sometimes even identify the influence. However, influence is very, very different at this stage because the articulation of the composition, even though it may have some similarities, has so many other things that defer direct comparison. When we move up to a secondary aggregate of of traits. Then we move to probably a little bit more of a level that I would call a level of homage, that of shared style, or even the zeitgeist, if you will. And at this level, this tolerance level rises, you can see. We find more commonalities which we almost leap to associate, where one can sometimes infer connections on the other level, on a tolerance level 1. Here, as we move up and check our tolerance level for appropriation, we see that there's a little bit more connection, a little stronger connection in many ways. And some of these may include stylized dances, for example, waltzes. If you wait for a moment and envision a waltz, many of you will have a common tempo in your mind, particularly if you've danced it. Similarly, the Passacaglia, the Folla, very similar styles, sometimes very clear lines, very clear harmonic uses. Patterns have been used for centuries, quite frankly. The 12-bar blues in America, 16-bar blues, there are certain patterns, of course, that have been used and stand the stress of time. And so as we look at these, we say this is part of the blues, and we can maybe establish some lineage in some cases. There are also, by the way, self-homage and certainly a continuity of style in one's own literature. Even if you take a look at Stravinsky's particular periods, late period with 12-tone music, the early period under the Russian guise, some of the middle periods, we see a certain language, a certain underpinning that is similar. And those connections are very strong. Mozart's Symphony number 8, a very early symphony, of course, and number 11 have striking similarities, not only in terms of small gestures found in the violin parts and instrumentation, but also in the use of key. They're both in D major. This level of tolerance and appropriation is one that raises quite a few flags. Of course, Mozart will sound like Mozart. Mozart may even quote Mozart, and there is not really much of an issue of ownership in that particular case. Other situations, however, raise a few questions. That of John Fogerty is one. John Fogerty was lead guitarist and songwriter of a group called Creedence Clearwater Revival. And he had written a song called Run Through the Jungle, a minor track, in my opinion, in an early album they had recorded with that band, the Creedence Clearwater Revival. Later on, he became a solo artist and decided to publish some of his music and perform some of his music. And a song called The Old Man Down the Road had many similarities to Run Through the Jungle. They aren't the same song, yet it was enough of a similarity, again, going up to the second aggregate with certain styles, phrasings, mode and key, a metric family that was similar. It was in 4/4, both were duple based. Harmonic family, the harmonies are quite simple, and in many families of basic elements were similar. The melodic contour, one would almost think that he was thinking of the other piece, but in any case, whether or not it's simply an expression, or another expression of one's compositional approach, the two pieces were close enough that a copyright board brought them to arms with one another. The person who claimed that he was quoting himself, the record company, if you will, and John Fogerty, who had moved on to another record company. And that particular fight between the record company, old and new, led to a lawsuit. And certainly some discussion had been had that needed to be settled out of court. One also has to consider the fact that sometimes the courts decide differently. Whether or not that first settlement led to any monetary award, certainly the second one is publicized quite well, where Alan Thicke had created a song called Blurred Lines, and the family of Marvin Gaye had suggested that it relied heavily on gut to give it up. There are many different arguments about whether or not this lawsuit was settled correctly for over $1 million. However, Thicke had paid that amount to the Marvin Gaye family, and many of the similarities that they had pointed out were secondary aggregates. I would argue that perhaps this lawsuit resulted in a decision that was not necessarily fair, as the amount of appropriation that exists even currently in R&B music and pop music and indeed in art music is high enough that a secondary aggregate may not really define inappropriate or if you will, inappropriate appropriation or misappropriation. In this particular case, there are many elements of style. Instrumentation is similar, key is similar, yet there are a number of dissimilarities that would be found at a different level. And that level is called a primary aggregate. In the case of a primary aggregate, we have a clear sense of appropriation, and the tolerance level for this is 3. It's rather high in my view. This is when motifs are borrowed, melody is borrowed, counterpoint is almost literal, if you will. Think of a type of riff on the bottom, for example, Can't Stop Believing by a group called Journey. Bum, da, 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 da. This melody goes beneath the vocal melody. There are examples in Bach as well, but that type of counterpoint, harmonic choices and so forth, and articulation of these things with melody crossed the line for many people. If Britten had not, quite frankly, attributed his melody for Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra to Handel, which we had shown earlier, then this might have been considered an example of misappropriation. However, the appropriation was appropriate. The appropriation was used for if you will, a theme on which something else was built. Theme and variation has had a long history, and certainly that is an example of theme and variation, although done through the use of varying timbres. An example of this level of appropriation that is probably considered with more tolerance is Paul Simon's American Tune. American Tune is about Paul Simon's disillusionment with the ideal of what could have been the United States of America, the American ideal of freedom and so forth. And so, inspired by Bach, he harkens back to the use of a tune, O Haupt voll Blut und Werden, also known as O Sacred Head Thou Wounded. O Sacred Head Thou Wounded. The image in that particular hymn is that of Christ walking to the cross, of the great hope, if you will, as America would have been, bleeding and of almost failing, and there being a sadness. And Paul Simon uses much of this hymn as the first section of his American Tune, perhaps to allude to the fact that what should have been isn't, and therefore used that tune very recently in terms of the current administration in the United States to point out that things have not gone according to plan, if you will, that the American dream is wounded. And that was sung originally during the Vietnam War, when the United States was involved in a conflict that wasn't universally supported, and Paul Simon has been singing it yet again. And so that type of appropriation, which is quite clear, and it also is attributed in interviews by Paul Simon, is a very different matter. Were it not attributed, or if it were copyrighted, we would have issues of misappropriation, be it attribute is part of the important part here, acknowledging the resource for something. We should move on to a final few notices here. Misappropriation is obviously the permitting of the impression of ownership of an artifact from another culture. In that case, misappropriation raises many, many issues, ethical issues, that really this paper is not designed to discuss. However, this paper is designed to discuss the fact that appropriation in music is part and parcel of its soul, of the way music is created, inspired. And indeed, sometimes it is a synergy created between various sources that creates the inspiration and the new composition that we enjoy. Something about a past piece, perhaps in our training, perhaps in our experience, creates something new and is combining of these things. Synergy is often thought in much psychological literature to be the source of inspiration. And there are several books, and you'll find these in my bibliography, that deal with the fact that sometimes entering a field, not knowing a great deal about it, but bringing a new vision from field A to field B is what creates imagination, is what leads to invention, is what creates a composition. And so even though that is not a hard and fast rule, one can consider the importance of appropriation in music in many different ways. What I've done today, however, was indicate the level of tolerance for certain gestures being brought from one area to another. And there are two types of appropriation we've discussed today. Of course, the first was that of appropriation of style, of technique from one genre into the performance of a particular piece. And that is a more general way in which one's ability to perform, even interpret, can affect the establishment or articulation of a, quote, perfect version of a piece. The other thing we had spoken about, of course, is the tolerance levels for particular compositions of pieces. And so when a piece is composed, it owes a great deal to other areas, other genres, and other resources. These things put together really paint a very different picture of music. And when we speak of a lack or if you will, the ethics of appropriation, we need to take into account that similarly some arts, such as music, are heavily appropriated in terms of their very nature. I hope you have enjoyed this paper for today. I've tried to reduce what would have been a 45-minute talk and with many other details and examples into something much, much shorter. And I hope that you have found this to be a rather a clear, if you will, abstract, extended abstract of my work. Some resources are found on this page, and I'd like to thank you. It has been a joy to be able to present this, and I hope that maybe in the future I can present another paper in person to this wonderful conference. Thank you.